We get company.
Broadsword calling Danny boy.
I'm glad it's you.
Well, I understand double O's have a very short life expectancy, so your mistake will be short-lived.
Would you like some refreshments?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank
Enjoy the show.
Hi there. Welcome to Sitting Through the Credits, a film review podcast covering new releases, cult classics, and everything in between. My name is Matt, and for this very first episode, I'll be diving into a black and white 20th Century Fox classic from the late 1930s. I ummed and ahed about which film to focus on for this first podcast review, and I ultimately made my choice because of two experiences. The first, a recent trip to see The Hound of the Baskervilles on stage at the New Theatre Royal in Lincoln, where Colin Baker and Terry Malloy played Holmes and Watson, and the second, a recent watch of Enola Holmes 2 on Netflix, both of which were productions I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm a long-time fan of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes works, and so I was inspired to dip back in time to 1939's The Hound of the Baskervilles, this year being the 120th anniversary of its publication.
About 50 yards from where Sir Charles fell dead were footprints.
A man's or a woman's?
Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
Directed by Sidney Lamfield from a screenplay written by Ernest Pascal, The Hound of the Baskervilles marked the debut of Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce as the eponymous Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson, and would be the first of 14 films to star the duo. Despite having viewed many of Basil Rathbone's Holmes films and being an avid reader of Sherlock Holmes canon, this was actually a first-time watch for me. The adaptation of this story that I'd most watched in my youth was the 1959 version by Hammer Films, starring Peter Cushing as Holmes, with Sir Christopher Lee playing the role of Sir Henry Baskerville.
Gentlemen, I must ask you to accept my apologies. Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes. How do you do? Very glad to meet you both. I'm sorry if I've embarrassed you.
As the final 12 of Basil Rathbone's Holmes films were the Universal Pictures movies, which took the detective out of his usual Victorian time period and placed him in the contemporary wartime 1940s, where Holmes and Watson were used as Allied morale-boosting propaganda, it is refreshing to see them at home in 1889 in this adaptation. In fact, this film is the first Sherlock Holmes adaptation to feature Holmes and Watson in their period setting rather than in a contemporary time frame. As the first in a series of films that became well known for their habit of playing fast and loose with the stories they purported to be adapting, 1939's The Hound of the Baskervilles is remarkably faithful to its source material. The majority of the characters' names remain unchanged, with many key pieces of dialogue lifted directly from the novel. It is also clear to see that a real effort has been made to match the film scenes to the famous illustrations of Sidney Paget, which accompanied the story's original publication in the Strand magazine between August 1901 and April 1902. The Hound of the Baskervilles makes for an interesting choice for the first outing of a new Holmes and Watson, as fans of the novel will know that Holmes is absent for a good amount of the story, meaning that Nigel Bruce's Watson is promoted to the lead for a significant amount of the film's runtime. Although Bruce's later portrayal of the character in the Universal films was mostly played for laughs, his Watson often used as a bumbling comedic foil for Basil Rathbone's commanding and astute Holmes, in my view in this first film he produces his best performance, being a competent and reliable companion for Holmes. The warm friendship between the pair is particularly noteworthy, Rathbone and Bruce's versions of their characters both being on a lighter, wittier side than some of the sharper portrayals of Holmes, such as that of the great Jeremy Brett. At all times I was convinced that despite their differences, the pair were firm friends, and it was no surprise that the great detective would trust Sir Henry's life in Watson's capable hands in his absence.
Really, Watson, you've excelled yourself.
Does anything escape me?
Almost everything, my dear fellow.
Huh?
For such a famous pairing, however, neither Basil Rathbone nor Nigel Bruce received top billing for this film, that instead going to Richard Green, who played Sir Henry, with Rathbone billed second and Bruce fourth. Needless to say, after the success of this first outing, the pair would receive top billing in each of their remaining Sherlock Holmes films. There are a few elements of the story that have been altered or dropped in this adaptation. Characters removed from the tale include Laura Lyons, the Stapletons' manservant Anthony, and even Inspector Lestrade, although he makes his first appearance at the very end of chapter 13 of the 15-chapter novel. The escaped convict Selden, the Notting Hill murderer, is never named in the film, nor are locations such as Merripit House. The surname of the Barrymores is changed to Barrymore because of the American theatrical Barrymore family, notably Lionel, Ethel and John, who were all acting at the time. And the grisly fate of Dr. Mortimer's spaniel is also removed. Beryl Stapleton's character probably suffers the most in this adaptation, her character being simplified, losing her Spanish heritage and connections to other characters, and her ambiguity in the novel is unfortunately traded for a more classic Hollywood ending. Ultimately, though, I'd be hard-pressed to criticise 1939's The Hound of the Baskervilles. If pushed, my biggest critique would be the conclusion of the story, which feels sadly abrupt and even fails to show the capture of the guilty party. This ending is somewhat remedied by the fascinating choice for the film's final line.
Good night. Good night. Good night. Good night, Mr. Holmes. Good night. Oh, Watson, the needle.
Despite Basil Rathbone's energetic and upbeat portrayal of Holmes, Oh, Watson, the Needle is a clear reference to Holmes's cocaine habit and was viewed as such in 1939 when the censors removed the line before the film made its way into theatres. The choice is particularly fascinating when the novel ends with Holmes suggesting that Watson and he go to the opera to watch Giacomo Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots. The drug reference would later be returned to the film when The Hound of the Baskervilles was restored and re-released in 1975. In addition to Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, a wealth of British acting talent was assembled for this American production, including the aforementioned Richard Green, who would become most famous for his television portrayal of Robin Hood between 1955 and 1960. Lionel Atwill would later trade this production's role of Dr. James Mortimer for Sherlock's nemesis, Professor James Moriarty, in 1942's Sherlock Holmes and the Secret Weapon. Another important part of Holmes' canon is the first appearance of Scottish actor Mary Gordon, who makes her debut as the housekeeper Mrs. Hudson, a role she would go on to play on 9 further occasions opposite Rathbone and Bruce. One key member of the cast remains uncredited, however, the titular Hound, who was played by the 156-pound blue Great Dane Blitzen. Although mentioned in the film's promotional materials, Blitzen's name was changed in these to Chief, as Blitzen was deemed to sound too similar to the blitzkrieg tactics that were being employed by the German military in the very year this film was released. 1939's The Hound of the Baskervilles has a 1 hour and 20-minute runtime and remains as one of the best adaptations of one of Arthur Conan Doyle's most famous and enduring stories. The picture was shot entirely in studio and on the 20th Century Fox backlot in the heart of Century City on Los Angeles' west side. The filming involved the construction of an incredibly detailed 300 by 200 feet model of the moor, replete with structures including Baskerville Hall. Indeed, the wilds of Dartmoor and its fictional Great Grimpen Mire have rarely looked so sinister and atmospheric on screen, which can only be expected from a film which famously used a reported $93,000 of its budget on fog machines. Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce were both vocal of the positive experience they had on set for this picture, Rathbone finding it a stimulating experience creating his version of Holmes, and Bruce fondly reminiscing about the mood of light-hearted enjoyment in an atmosphere which baffled director Sidney Lanfield, who was all too used to on-set arguments with his cast. The film was sadly overlooked for awards, although in a year which gave us Gone with the Wind, Wuthering Heights and The Wizard of Oz, perhaps that is to be expected.
Murder, my dear Watson. Refined, cold-blooded murder.
Murder?
1939's The Hound of the Baskervilles is a stellar example of Gothic detective fiction, and it is no surprise that after tackling their supposedly supernatural foe, Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce would return as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson to solve further crimes from 221B Baker Street for the next 7 years. I'd have to rate this film as a 9 out of 10, with the caveat that I'm a big fan of the characters and of detective fiction as a whole. If you're a fan of Gothic horror and detective fiction, then this black and white atmospheric classic is a must-watch in my view. I've been deliberately careful when it comes to discussing spoilers, so I hope that if you come to watch this story with no prior knowledge of who done it, you will be as entertained and surprised in the company of Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce as audiences were in 1939. A big thank you to any and everybody who's listened to this first podcast of mine. I'm hoping to bring more film reviews to you in the near future.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished.
Replicants are like any other machine. They're either a benefit or a hazard.
Racing is life.
What's the boogeyman?
As a matter of fact, it was.
End of story.